At just 24 years old, Emma Carter walked out of her office carrying nothing but a cardboard box after her company replaced her entire department with automation. She had only $95 left that she could afford to lose. And instead of paying another month's rent, she spent every dollar buying an abandoned logging camp office that everyone in town called nothing more than a collapsing shack in the woods. The auctioneer laughed. The small crowd shook their heads. Some even wondered aloud why anyone would waste their last money on a place that hadn't mattered in over 50 years. 3 weeks later, while clearing out a dust-covered filing cabinet inside that forgotten office, Emma noticed a loose wooden panel hidden behind the back wall. When she pulled it away, she discovered an old, leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth. A journal that every lumber worker had sworn would never be found again. And what she read on its first page would completely change everything people believed about the logging camp. But before we uncover what was written inside, I'd love to know where you're listening from today and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below to say hello. And if you're enjoying stories about forgotten family legacies, hidden histories, and life-changing discoveries, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next journey, wherever you are. I wish you a wonderful day, and now, let's go back to the moment Emma lost everything. Emma Carter had expected to lose her job someday. She just never imagined it would happen at 24 because a machine could answer emails faster than she could. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. 12 minutes to erase the 3 years she had spent building a career at North Valley Freight Logistics. Her manager avoided eye contact as a polished presentation filled the conference room screen. Charts showed higher efficiency, lower costs, and faster customer response times. Artificial intelligence had exceeded every target. The company no longer needed most of its operations staff. Emma listened as names were read one after another. When hers came, she simply nodded. No one argued. No one cried. They quietly accepted envelopes explaining severance pay and career transition resources that sounded helpful but felt hollow. By noon, she was standing outside the office carrying a cardboard box that held a coffee mug, 2 notebooks, a framed photo of her late parents, and a small potted cactus her coworker Mia had once joked was impossible to kill. "I'm sorry." She kept driving through the small mountain town, unsure where she would sleep that night. A faded sign outside the county administration office caught her attention. County surplus auction today. Curious more than hopeful, she walked inside. The room held a handful of farmers, contractors, and collectors interested in old equipment. Near the end of the auction, the clerk announced one final property. "Former Fire Patrol Cabin, Pine Ridge District. Structure sold as is, no utilities. Buyer assumes all responsibility." A grainy photograph appeared on a screen, showing a weathered wooden cabin surrounded by tall pines. People exchanged amused looks. Someone muttered that bears probably owned it now. One rainy afternoon, she visited her landlord to ask for a little more time. He listened politely before shaking his head. "I wish I could help, Emma, but I have payments too." She packed her apartment that evening, selling almost everything she owned except clothing, a sleeping bag, and the cardboard box from her office. After paying what she owed, $95 remained in her wallet. She stared at the bills spread across the passenger seat. $95. It wasn't enough for another apartment, barely enough for a motel, and certainly not enough to build a new life. She drove aimlessly through the county until a faded roadside sign caught her attention. "County surplus auction today." Curious more than hopeful, she followed the arrows toward a small community hall. Most people had gathered to bid on old tractors, rusted equipment, and abandoned storage sheds. Emma wandered past the listings taped to a bulletin board until one line stopped her. Former Black Pine Logging Camp Office. Minimum bid $95. She frowned. The property description was only 3 sentences long. An abandoned office building deep in the forest. Structure sold as is. Buyer responsible for all repairs. "You're not actually looking at that place, are you?" an older man beside her asked with a chuckle. Emma shrugged. "Just reading." "Roof leaks, windows broken, no electricity, been empty for decades. Even raccoons don't stay there anymore." Another bidder laughed. "Someone should pay us $95 to haul it away." The crowd shared an easy laugh before returning to the more valuable auction items. Emma folded the listing into her pocket. A useless building in the woods should have made no sense at all, yet the more she thought about it, the more practical it seemed. She couldn't afford rent. She needed somewhere that belonged to her, even if it was falling apart. At least no landlord could ask her to leave when bidding reached the logging camp office. The auctioneer looked around the room. "Opening at $95. Silence. "Any bidders?" Emma slowly raised her hand. Heads turned. Someone near the back whispered, "She's serious." The auctioneer smiled politely. $95. Any higher offers?" None came. His wooden gavel struck once. "Sold!" As Emma signed the paperwork, the auctioneer couldn't hide a grin. "Well, miss, I hope you know something the rest of us don't." A few people laughed again. Emma smiled politely, though her stomach tightened with doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had just spent every dollar she had on a collapsing building no one wanted. Late that afternoon, she followed an overgrown gravel road into black pine forest. Tall evergreens surrounded the narrow path until an old wooden office emerged between the trees. Time had stripped the paint from its walls, and weeds pushed through cracked steps leading to the front porch. One window hung crooked, while another had been covered with plywood years earlier. The place looked tired rather than frightening, as though it had simply been forgotten. Emma unlocked the front door with the heavy brass key included in the sale. It creaked open, releasing the smell of dust, old timber, and damp paper. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, revealing overturned chairs, rusted filing cabinets, and shelves sagging beneath abandoned ledgers. "Home," she whispered. Unsure whether to laugh or cry, she set down her cardboard box and walked slowly through the single-room office, imagining where she could clean first. Near the back wall stood a large oak desk coated in years of dust. 3 drawers opened easily. The 4th refused to move. She pulled harder, nothing. Kneeling, she noticed there wasn't even a visible lock. It felt as though something on the inside was holding the drawer firmly shut. Emma rested her hand against the worn wood, puzzled. Whatever had kept that final drawer closed had survived decades of abandonment. And for the first time since buying the forgotten office, she felt that this old building might still have one secret left to reveal. Morning sunlight slipped through the dirty windows of the abandoned logging camp office, revealing countless dust particles floating through the still air. Emma Carter unrolled her sleeping bag from the corner where she had spent her first night. The building had creaked with every gust of wind, and somewhere outside, an owl had called long after midnight. But she had slept better than expected. For the first time in weeks, no landlord could knock on her door demanding rent. The office might be old and forgotten, but at least it belonged to her. She opened a can of soup over a small camping stove and looked around the room. There was far more work than she could possibly finish alone. Broken chairs lay scattered across the floor. Cobwebs stretched between shelves filled with moldy ledgers. Several ceiling boards sagged dangerously, and leaves had blown through cracked windows over many autumns. She made a simple list in one of her notebooks: clean. Repair windows, check roof, restore electricity, inspect water. The list looked impossible, yet writing it down made the task feel less overwhelming. She spent the morning sweeping years of dirt toward the front door, underneath the dust. The wooden floor was scratched but surprisingly solid. She stacked broken furniture outside and carefully sorted through boxes filled with old office supplies. Most were ruined, though she found a handful of usable pencils, an intact flashlight, and several unopened notebooks left behind decades earlier. Around noon, the silence was interrupted by the sound of a pickup truck pulling onto the gravel road. Emma stepped outside cautiously. A man in his early 30s climbed from the driver's seat, carrying a toolbox. "You, Emma?" he asked. "Yes." "Name's Caleb Turner. The auction office called yesterday. They said the new owner might need electrical work." Emma smiled, relieved to see another friendly face. "I wish I could afford much." Caleb looked toward the weathered building. "Honestly, I was curious enough to come even if you couldn't." He laughed softly. "Nobody's owned this place in years." Together they walked through the office while Caleb inspected the exposed wiring. He shook his head several times. "The main service was disconnected long ago. Most of these wires will have to go." "Can it be fixed?" Emma asked. "Eventually. It'll take time." He noticed her disappointed expression before adding, "I've worked on worse." As Caleb examined the breaker box, Emma continued cleaning nearby shelves. They talked while they worked. Caleb had grown up in the county and remembered hearing stories about Black Pine logging camp from his grandfather. He always said this place used to be busy enough that you could hear saws running from miles away. Caleb said, "Hard to imagine now." Emma nodded. "It feels like everyone forgot it ever existed." "Pretty much." During the afternoon, they moved an enormous filing cabinet away from the back wall to make room for repairs. As it scraped across the floor, both stopped at the same moment. Behind the cabinet, the wall looked noticeably cleaner than everything surrounding it. Dust covered nearly every surface inside the office except a narrow section directly behind the heavy cabinet. Caleb frowned. "That's strange." Emma touched the cleaner boards. "Like someone moved this not that long ago." "Maybe after the camp closed," Caleb suggested. She shook her head. "The rest of the room hasn't been touched in decades." Neither spoke for several seconds. There were no footprints left in the dust now. But the difference in the wood suggested that at some point, years after everyone believed the office had been abandoned, someone had deliberately pulled the cabinet away from the wall before sliding it back into place. Caleb eventually shrugged. "Could have been a hunter looking for shelter." "Maybe." Still, the discovery stayed in Emma's mind. They pushed the cabinet aside permanently and continued working. Later, while removing warped shelves near the front entrance, Caleb found several old electrical inspection stickers dated nearly 20 years after the logging camp had officially closed. "That can't be right," he muttered. Emma looked closer. The faded date was unmistakable. Someone had electricity inspected long after the camp shut down. Caleb rubbed the paper carefully. Either the records are wrong, or somebody came back here. The office suddenly felt less abandoned than it had that morning. By late afternoon, Caleb packed his tools. "I'll price out the materials. Maybe we can restore one room first." Emma thanked him sincerely. "I appreciate you coming." "You're making a brave choice," he said before leaving. "I hope this place gives something back." After his truck disappeared down the gravel road, Emma drove into town hoping to learn more about the old camp. The local historical museum occupied a modest brick building beside the courthouse. Inside, shelves displayed photographs, logging equipment, and faded maps of the surrounding forests. Behind the front desk sat an elderly man wearing glasses and carefully labeling old photographs. "Can I help you?" he asked warmly. "I'm Emma Carter." "Hank Morrison." They shook hands. "What brings you here?" I recently bought the old Black Pine logging camp office. Hank paused long enough for surprise to cross his face. Well, that's not something I hear every day. Emma explained how she had lost her job, purchased the abandoned office, and begun cleaning it. Hank listened patiently before leading her toward a large wall map. Black Pine employed hundreds of workers during its best years, he said. Families lived out there. Children attended a small school. Then the timber industry declined, and the camp slowly disappeared. Are there many records? Emma asked, hopefully. Hank sighed. Not nearly as many as there should be. Fires, neglect, poor storage over time. Most company documents vanished. He opened a filing drawer and produced several photographs of smiling lumber workers standing outside the same office Emma now owned. History disappears faster than people realize. Emma studied the weathered faces. They looked proud despite the hard work reflected in their clothes. I'd like to preserve whatever's left, Hank smiled. Then you're doing something worthwhile. As evening settled over the forest, Emma returned to the office, carrying copies of the old photographs. She placed them carefully on the oak desk before continuing her cleaning. While removing a loose board from the bottom of a tall storage cabinet, she heard something small strike the wooden floor. It bounced once before stopping near her boot. Emma bent down and picked up a tarnished brass key no longer than her finger. It was coated in dust so thick it had nearly blended into the wood. She turned it over slowly. There were no markings except years of wear from someone's hand. Instinctively, she looked toward the oak desk at the back of the room. The lowest drawer, the one that refused to open, waited exactly where she had left it. Emma walked across the room, inserted the old brass key into the hidden keyhole beneath the handle, and felt it slide perfectly into place. Emma held her breath as she turned the brass key. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a dull metallic click, something inside the oak desk shifted. She wrapped both hands around the handle and pulled gently. This time, the drawer slid open a few inches before stopping against years of packed dust. She pulled harder until it finally opened completely, releasing the dry scent of old paper and aged leather. Unlike the other drawers, this one contained only a single object. Resting neatly in the center lay a dark brown journal wrapped in faded oilcloth and tied with a thin leather cord. Someone had taken care to protect it from moisture before hiding it away. Emma carefully lifted it onto the desktop. The cover showed years of wear, but the leather remained intact. There was no title and no owner's name. Only a small pine tree had been pressed into the corner of the cover. She untied the cord with slow, careful movements. The first page had yellowed with age, yet the handwriting remained remarkably clear. Across the top, someone had written, "For those who come after us, may they remember what these woods once gave." Emma quietly read the words again. They sounded less like a diary and more like a promise. She turned another page. Instead of one signature, dozens of names covered the bottom of the opening entry. Some were written boldly, while others appeared shaky, as though older hands had struggled to hold the pen. Above the signatures stood a single sentence. No one man owns this story. Emma leaned back in her chair. She had expected company records or financial ledgers. Instead, she held something deeply personal. She spent the next hour reading the earliest entries. The journal described ordinary days inside Black Pine logging camp decades earlier. Workers woke before sunrise, shared breakfast in the cookhouse, and disappeared into the forest before daylight fully reached the valley. The entries spoke of frozen winters, dangerous storms, broken wagon wheels, and evenings spent repairing tools beside warm stoves. They joked about practical mishaps and celebrated births, weddings, and safe returns after difficult logging seasons. Although none of the writers identified themselves individually, each entry ended with another collection of signatures, suggesting the journal belonged to the entire crew rather than a single author. Emma smiled more than once while reading. The men did not sound like distant historical figures. They sounded like neighbors. One passage described several workers pooling money to buy boots for a young employee who had arrived with worn-out shoes. Another told of the very camp rebuilding a widow's porch after a violent storm. Their lives had been hard, yet the journal was filled with quiet kindness rather than complaints. As afternoon sunlight shifted across the room, Emma closed the journal long enough to eat a simple lunch. She could not stop thinking about the people whose names filled its pages. After finishing, she decided someone in town might recognize them. She carefully wrapped the journal again, placed it inside her backpack, and drove to the small house where Hank Morrison had told her she could usually find Martha Doyle. Martha answered the door herself, leaning lightly on a wooden cane. Though well into her 70s, her eyes remained bright and curious. "You must be the young woman who bought the old office," she said before Emma introduced herself. "Hank called yesterday." Emma smiled. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. Come inside." Martha's living room displayed framed black and white photographs covering nearly every wall. Many showed logging crews standing proudly beside enormous pine trees. Others captured community picnics, school classes, and holiday gatherings. Emma explained how she had discovered the journal hidden inside the desk. Martha's expression immediately grew serious. "May I?" Emma handed it over carefully. Martha opened the first pages with remarkable gentleness, almost as if greeting an old friend. She adjusted her glasses before tracing one name with a trembling finger. "Samuel Doyle," she whispered. "My father." A faint smile crossed her face. "I haven't seen his handwriting since I was a little girl." She continued turning pages. "There's Ben Walker, Elias Green, Thomas Reed." Occasionally she paused to tell Emma a brief story. One man had carved toys for every child at Christmas. Another had been famous for singing loudly while sharpening axes before dawn. Another always carried peppermints for nervous children visiting the camp. The names slowly became real people. "Did your father ever mention this journal?" Emma asked. Martha shook her head. "Never. We knew they kept records, but nothing like this." She turned several more pages before stopping abruptly. "These pages are missing." Emma looked closer. Roughly a dozen sheets had been carefully removed near the center of the journal. The torn edges were old, suggesting they had been taken out many years earlier. Martha frowned thoughtfully. "Whoever removed them did it neatly." "Do you think they contain something important?" Emma asked. "I honestly don't know." Martha closed the journal for a moment. "My father wasn't a man who hid things without reason." They spent another hour talking about Black Pine. Martha admitted that memories had faded as older generations passed away. Many buildings disappeared after the camp closed, while families moved elsewhere searching for work. "People remember pieces," she said quietly. "Very few remember the whole story anymore." Before Emma left, Martha gently squeezed her hand. "Thank you for bringing this here instead of keeping it to yourself. It belongs to everyone whose families were part of the camp," Emma replied. Martha smiled warmly. "I think my father would have liked you." The drive back through the forest felt different now. The abandoned office no longer seemed empty. Every room echoed with the lives described inside the journal as evening approached. Emma carried it back to the oak desk and continued reading where she had stopped. The entries gradually shifted in tone. Daily routines remained, but the writers hinted that conditions around the camp were changing. Timber became harder to find. Deliveries arrived less often. Several entries mentioned difficult meetings without explaining their purpose. Still, no one blamed anyone else. The journal continued emphasizing cooperation, hope, and shared responsibility. Emma reached another section where additional pages had been removed. She counted nearly 15 missing leaves altogether. Whatever story they once held was gone. She sighed and carefully turned to the next surviving page. The handwriting appeared hurried, as though written at the end of a long day. She read slowly until she reached the final line preserved on that page. If anyone ever finds these words, go to pine tree number 27. Emma stared at the sentence. There was no explanation, no map, and no indication of who had written it. She quickly turned the next page, hoping for more. But the following entry returned to ordinary camp life without mentioning the message again. Emma looked out the window toward the darkening forest, where thousands of towering pines stretched beyond the old office. Somewhere among them stood a tree marked only by a number written decades earlier, waiting for someone willing to look. The next morning, Emma Carter copied the final sentence from the journal into her notebook before reading it one more time. If anyone ever finds these words, go to pine tree number 27. It was the only direct instruction hidden among dozens of ordinary entries, and it refused to leave her thoughts. She spread one of Hank Morrison's old maps across the oak desk, comparing faded logging roads with the landscape surrounding the abandoned office. Most markings had disappeared beneath handwritten notes and years of wear. But several numbered work sections still remained. If the workers had once numbered important trees, there was at least a chance that one of them still stood. Emma called Caleb Turner shortly after breakfast. I know this may sound strange, she said after explaining what she had discovered in the journal. Caleb laughed softly. After everything you found already, strange is becoming normal. Would you help me look? Give me 30 minutes. By mid-morning, they were following an overgrown trail leading deeper into black pine forest. Caleb carried a small shovel, a handsaw, and a backpack filled with water bottles. Emma carried the journal. Hank's map and a notebook. Fallen branches covered much of the old logging road, forcing them to move slowly around thick patches of ferns and young saplings that had reclaimed the abandoned route. Hard to believe hundreds of people worked out here, Caleb said. Emma nodded. The journal makes it sound like a small town. My grandfather always said the forest never stayed empty for long. Once people leave, nature moves back in. They stopped several times to compare landmarks with the old map. A narrow creek matched one faded drawing almost perfectly. A weathered stone foundation, likely the remains of an old storage shed, confirmed they were heading in the right direction. Still, no numbered trees appeared. Hours passed before Emma noticed something unusual carved into the bark of a massive pine standing alone near a clearing. Most of the carving had been swallowed by decades of growth, but a faint outline remained. She brushed away loose moss with her hand. Caleb stepped closer. That looks like a 2. Emma continued cleaning the bark until another faded number emerged beside it. 27, she whispered. The tree towered above everything surrounding it. Its trunk was far wider than either of them could reach with outstretched arms. Unlike many neighboring trees, it had never been cut. Emma rested one hand against the rough bark, wondering how many of the workers whose names filled the journal had once stood in the same place. Now what? Caleb asked quietly. Emma reread the journal entry. It offered no further instructions. She slowly walked around the tree, studying the ground. Thick roots spread in every direction beneath a carpet of pine needles. Nothing seemed unusual until Caleb noticed a slight depression near the base of the trunk. This patch feels softer, he said, pressing his boot into the earth. Emma knelt beside him and carefully cleared away layers of needles with her hands. Beneath them, the soil looked darker than the surrounding ground. Caleb unfolded the small shovel. "Mind if I try?" Within minutes, the blade struck something solid with a dull, metallic sound. Both froze. Caleb looked at Emma before carefully removing more dirt from around the object. Gradually, the edges of a small rectangular metal box emerged from the earth. Rust covered most of its surface, but it remained surprisingly intact. Together, they lifted it from the shallow hole and brushed away years of packed soil. The lid resisted at first, before finally opening with a loud creak. Emma's heartbeat quickened, despite reminding herself not to expect treasure. Inside the box lay several neatly bundled items wrapped in brittle cloth. The first bundle contained black and white photographs protected between pieces of wax paper. Emma lifted the top photograph carefully. It showed dozens of smiling lumber workers standing outside the very office she now owned. She immediately recognized the porch, the front steps, and even the large oak desk visible through the open doorway behind them. Caleb leaned closer. "That's your building." She nodded. Turning over the photograph, she found names written in faded pencil. Many matched signatures from the journal. The second bundle contained a folded hand-drawn map marked with trails, cabins, and work areas no longer visible on modern maps. Several locations had circles around them, though none included written explanations. Emma carefully placed it inside her notebook to prevent further damage. At the bottom of the box rested 3 sealed envelopes tied together with worn string. The paper had yellowed, but the wax seals had long since broken apart. Emma opened the first letter slowly, afraid the fragile pages might tear. The handwriting differed from the journal, yet remained neat and deliberate. "To whoever keeps this safe," the letter began. "Some truths belong to their proper time." Emma exchanged a quiet glance with Caleb before continuing. The letter described difficult months near the end of the camp's operation, but never explained exactly what had happened. Instead, it repeatedly emphasized protecting families, preserving dignity, and honoring promises made between workers. It ended without a signature. The second letter thanked several men for standing together during uncertain times. Again, no specific event was mentioned. The final envelope felt slightly heavier than the others. Emma unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. Unlike the previous letters, this one contained only a few short paragraphs. "If these records are ever discovered," it read, "remember that the people of this town were never told the full story. They deserved better than silence, but there were reasons we accepted it. One day someone will understand." Caleb remained silent for several moments after Emma finished reading. "Whatever happened," he finally said, "they wanted it remembered." Emma looked back toward the towering pine. "Not by everyone," she answered quietly. "By someone they hoped would care enough to keep looking." She gathered the photographs, map, and letters carefully before placing the empty metal box back into her backpack. Nothing they had found suggested hidden money or valuable property. Instead, every object pointed toward ordinary people trying to preserve something far more personal than wealth. As they prepared to leave, Emma read the final paragraph once more. One sentence stood apart from the rest, written slightly darker than the surrounding words, as though added at the last moment. "The truth this town never learned is written elsewhere. Protect it until the right time." Emma barely slept after returning from Pine Tree number 27. The photographs, hand-drawn map, and letters remained spread across the oak desk, illuminated by the soft glow of a camping lantern. Every item seemed carefully preserved rather than hidden in panic. Whoever buried the metal box had wanted it found someday, but only by someone willing to follow the journal's instructions. Early the next morning, she packed everything into protective folders before driving to the local historical museum. Hank Morrison was already arranging new exhibits when she walked through the front door carrying her backpack. He looked up and smiled. Judging by your expression, I'd say you found something. Emma carefully placed the photographs, map, and letters across the large reading table. Hank adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. His smile slowly disappeared, replaced by quiet concentration. He examined every photograph before turning each one over to read the handwritten names. "I've seen copies of a few of these faces," he said softly, "but never originals in such good condition." Emma showed him the map next. Hank unfolded it with remarkable care. "This is extraordinary." His finger traced abandoned roads, work camps and supply routes that no longer appeared on modern records. Some of these locations haven't existed for 50 years. Finally, Emma handed him the letters. He read each one without interruption. When he finished, he remained silent for nearly a minute. "None of this explains what happened," Emma said. "It only hints at something everyone agreed to keep quiet." Hank nodded slowly. "Let's compare what you found with the museum archives." They spent most of the morning opening storage drawers filled with aging documents. Payroll sheets survived for only a handful of years. Property maps were incomplete. Employment records stopped abruptly near the camp's final decade. Several company ledgers referred to reports that were no longer attached. Emma noticed the same pattern again and again. References remained, but the supporting records had disappeared. "Is that normal?" she asked. Hank sighed. "Not really." He pulled another dusty file from a shelf. "Old records are often damaged by time, but this feels different." "Different how?" "Someone preserved enough to show the camp existed, but not enough to explain its final years." Emma looked around the archive room, lined with faded boxes. "Almost like parts of the story were intentionally left unfinished." Hank closed another empty folder. "That's exactly what troubles me." They searched until early afternoon without finding any mention of the journal, the buried box, or the letters. The missing pages inside the journal became even more frustrating. Whatever information they once contained might have connected every clue Emma had uncovered so far. Before leaving, Hank handed her a slip of paper with an address written neatly across it. "There's one person still alive who actually worked at Black Pine." Emma looked at the name. "Owen Briggs. Do you think he'll talk to me?" Hank hesitated before answering. "He's 81 now. People have asked about the camp before. Usually he refuses." "I'll try anyway." Hank gave a small, encouraging smile. "Sometimes the right questions matter as much as the right answers." That afternoon, Emma drove several miles outside town to a modest white farmhouse surrounded by old apple trees. Owen Briggs sat quietly on the front porch, watching birds gather near a weathered feeder. Though age had bent his shoulders, his eyes remained sharp. Emma introduced herself and explained why she had come. At first, Owen simply listened without speaking. When she mentioned the abandoned office, he nodded politely, but offered little response. "I understand if you don't want to discuss the past," Emma said. "I only hoped you might recognize some names." She showed him one of the photographs from the metal box. Owen smiled faintly. "There's Charlie. Best sawyer I ever worked with." He pointed toward another man. "And Joseph always carried a harmonica." His voice softened with memory. But when Emma gently asked about the camp's final years, the smile disappeared. "Those days are gone," he replied quietly. "Some things should stay there." Emma thanked him for his time and stood to leave. Before stepping off the porch, she paused. "There's one more thing." She opened her backpack and carefully removed the leather-bound journal. Owen's eyes fixed on it immediately. His expression changed before Emma had even untied the worn leather cord. His hands began to tremble. "Where he whispered. "Where did you find that?" "Hidden inside the old desk." Owen slowly reached toward the journal, but stopped just before touching it. Tears filled his eyes almost instantly. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Emma had expected curiosity. She had not expected grief. Owen finally rested both hands against his knees, struggling to steady his breathing. "I never thought I'd see it again," he said in a voice barely louder than the wind moving through the trees. Emma sat beside him without interrupting. He carefully opened the first page, studying the familiar signatures. One by one, he traced several names with his fingertips. "They're all gone now," he murmured. "Every one of them." A tear slipped down his weathered cheek. "We promised this would survive, even if we didn't." Emma felt her own throat tighten. The journal clearly meant far more than a historical record. It carried the weight of friendships, shared hardship, and memories that only one living person could still fully understand. "Mr. Briggs," she asked gently, "can you tell me why it was hidden?" Owen closed the journal slowly. He looked toward the distant forest beyond the fields, as though seeing another lifetime waiting among the trees. "Not today," he answered after a long silence. "I'm not ready." Emma nodded. She would not push him further. As she stood once more to leave, Owen held the journal for another quiet moment before returning it to her with surprising care. "Take good care of this," he said. "It's one of the last honest things we left behind." Emma accepted it respectfully. Just as she reached her car, Owen called after her. She turned. His voice remained soft, but his words carried unmistakable certainty. "There was another journal," he said. "The one you're holding was never the whole story." Emma drove back to the abandoned logging camp office with Owen Briggs's final words echoing in her mind. There was another journal. She placed the leather-bound book on the oak desk beside the photographs, letters and map before lighting her camping lantern. Everything she had discovered over the past week now pointed toward the same conclusion. The journal was never meant to tell the entire story. It was only one piece of something much larger. The following morning, she called Hank Morrison. "Owen spoke to me," she said. There was a brief silence. "He actually talked?" Hank asked with genuine surprise. "Not much, but he admitted there was another journal." "Then perhaps he's finally ready." They agreed to visit Owen together that afternoon. When they arrived at the farmhouse, Owen was sitting beneath the shade of an old maple tree instead of on the porch. He looked tired, yet somehow lighter than he had the previous day. As Emma approached, he offered a faint smile. "I suppose if the journal found its way back into the light, the rest shouldn't stay buried forever," Hank quietly greeted his old friend before the three of them settled into wooden chairs facing the fields. For several minutes, Owen simply watched the wind ripple through tall grass. Finally, he spoke. "People think Black Pine closed because the timber ran out." He shook his head gently. "That wasn't the whole truth." Emma remained silent, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "Toward the end, work became scarce. Every month, another crew lost hours. Families worried constantly. Men who had always believed hard work could solve anything suddenly had no certainty left." He paused, studying his weathered hands. "When you've spent your whole life swinging an axe, it's hard to imagine becoming unnecessary." Emma felt the words settle heavily inside her. Only weeks earlier, she had experienced a different version of the same fear after automation replaced her job. Owen continued, "The camp could have fallen apart. People might have blamed one another. Some wanted to leave immediately. Others wanted to fight the company. Most of us had children growing up together. We'd shared meals, weddings, funerals, and winters that nearly froze us solid. We weren't just coworkers." Hank nodded quietly. You were a community, exactly. Owen smiled faintly. That's something numbers on company reports never understood. He explained that as work declined, the lumber workers began gathering after long shifts inside the very office Emma now owned. No supervisors attended those evening meetings. The workers met alone, discussing how they could help one another survive uncertain months ahead. Some families had savings, others had almost nothing. A few older workers quietly suggested sharing what little they had instead of allowing neighbors to lose everything alone. Nobody ordered it, Owen said. Nobody signed contracts. We simply looked around the room and realized every family mattered. Emma pictured the large oak desk where the journal had been hidden. It was easy to imagine exhausted men sitting around it after dark, searching for hope together. Was that why the journal had so many signatures? She asked. Owen nodded. It belonged to everyone because every decision belonged to everyone. He described evenings spent recording ideas instead of arguments. Workers volunteered extra shifts whenever possible, with portions of those wages quietly set aside for families whose income had disappeared completely. Some repaired neighbors' homes without charging for labor. Others shared firewood, tools, clothing, or food. Nothing was recorded publicly because pride often made accepting help difficult. Instead, the journal preserved only enough information so future generations would understand that no family had faced those difficult years alone. Emma smiled softly. That sounds like the people I met while reading it. Owen returned the smile. The journal captured who we wanted to be. His expression gradually became more serious, but it didn't record everything. Emma waited. Certain discussions were written elsewhere, he admitted. Not because they were shameful, because they involved promises made between a smaller group. Hank leaned forward slightly. The second journal, Owen nodded once. Yes. He would not describe its contents, only that it continued where the first journal stopped. The missing pages Emma had noticed were intentionally removed because those conversations belonged with the second volume instead. Why separate them? Emma asked. Owen looked toward the distant tree line. Because the first journal belonged to every worker. The second belonged to those entrusted with carrying one final responsibility. Although Emma wanted to ask what responsibility he meant, she remembered the outline of trust that had guided every conversation since finding the journal. Owen always shared only what he believed the moment could bear. Pressing harder would accomplish nothing. Instead, she asked, "Did many people know where the second journal went?" Owen slowly shook his head. Very few. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead. After another thoughtful pause, he continued, telling stories from those final years at Black Pine. He spoke about mothers organizing shared meals so no child went hungry, teenagers gathering firewood for elderly neighbors, experienced loggers teaching younger men repair work so they could earn income after the camp slowed. None of the stories centered on money. They centered on dignity. Emma realized the greatest legacy preserved inside the first journal was not a dramatic secret, but a record of ordinary people choosing generosity when fear might easily have divided them. History usually remembers companies, Hank observed quietly, not communities. Owen smiled. That's why journals matter. As the afternoon sun lowered, his voice grew softer with fatigue. Emma stood, not wanting to exhaust him further. Thank you for trusting us, she said sincerely. Owen looked at the leather-bound journal resting inside Emma's bag. Take care of their words, he replied. They carried each other when the world told them they were no longer needed. Emma felt unexpected emotion rise inside her. She had arrived at Black Pine believing she had lost her own purpose after being replaced by automation. Yet every story Owen shared reminded her that a person's value had never depended entirely on the job they performed. Before leaving, Owen called her name once more. "If you're determined to finish this story," he said, "you'll have to find the second journal." Emma turned back. "Do you know where it is?" He nodded slowly, then looked toward the old railway line visible beyond the fields. The last place anyone saw it wasn't in the forest. He paused just long enough for Emma and Hank to exchange puzzled glances. It was taken to the old railway station before Black Pine closed, and no one ever brought it back. The following morning, Emma Carter met Caleb Turner outside the abandoned railway station on the edge of town. Years earlier, trains had carried lumber from Black Pine to distant mills, but now weeds pushed through cracked platforms, and broken windows reflected only empty tracks stretching toward the forest. Owen Briggs's final words had given them a destination, but little else. If the second journal had truly been brought here decades ago, there was no guarantee it had survived. Caleb adjusted the flashlight hanging from his backpack. "Ready?" Emma nodded. "Let's see what history forgot." The station doors had long since disappeared, making it easy to step inside. Dust coated the waiting room, while faded schedules still clung to one wall beneath cracked glass. Most furniture had been removed years earlier, leaving only a few benches and a heavy wooden counter. Emma unfolded the hand-drawn map recovered from the metal box beneath pine tree number 27. One corner showed a narrow trail connecting Black Pine Logging Camp to the railway station. Beside the station, someone had drawn a tiny square marked only with the initials R.S. "Record storage?" Caleb suggested. "Maybe." They searched the main building first. Empty filing cabinets lined one office, but nearly every drawer had been left open. Old freight records lay scattered across the floor, damaged beyond recognition by moisture and time. Emma carefully sorted through surviving papers, while Caleb inspected the rear rooms. Nothing mentioned Black Pine. After nearly an hour, Caleb called from the back hallway. "Emma, come look at this." She followed him to a narrow storage room hidden behind what had once been the station master's office. Several wooden shelves had collapsed years earlier, trapping dozens of dusty boxes beneath broken planks. Unlike the front offices, this room appeared to have been sealed after the station closed. Together they carefully lifted away fallen boards one at a time. Many boxes contained routine shipping forms, faded receipts, or maintenance reports. Others had been ruined completely. Emma almost suggested stopping when Caleb uncovered a smaller crate pushed deep beneath the lowest shelf. A handwritten label remained barely readable. Black Pine Archive. Emma's pulse quickened. They carried the crate into better light before removing its loose lid. Inside rested bundles of carefully tied documents wrapped in old brown paper. Someone had organized everything with remarkable care. Emma unfolded the first packet. It contained correspondence between railway clerks and logging supervisors, mostly discussing delivery schedules and freight delays. Interesting, but not what they were seeking. The second bundle held payroll summaries and inventory lists. Caleb reached for the final package, resting beneath everything else. Unlike the others, it had been wrapped in waxed cloth, similar to the first journal hidden inside the office desk. Emma untied the faded cord slowly. A familiar dark leather cover appeared beneath the cloth. Neither of them spoke. She gently lifted the journal into both hands. Though slightly thinner than the first volume, it carried the same embossed pine tree pressed into the corner. This time, however, a small Roman numeral 2 had been stamped beneath the symbol. "You found it," Caleb whispered. Emma carefully opened the cover. The first page carried no signatures. Instead, one short sentence had been written across the top. "For those entrusted to finish what we began." She slowly turned another page. The handwriting matched several entries from the first journal, but the tone had changed immediately. Rather than describing daily camp life, the writers recorded meetings held after work, listing contributions made by workers who volunteered portions of their wages for a common fund. Beside each amount appeared only initials instead of full names. The entries emphasized confidentiality, explaining repeatedly that no family receiving help should ever feel ashamed. Emma continued reading. As the weeks described in the journal passed, more workers joined the effort. Small donations accumulated into a fund used for groceries, medicine, school supplies, winter fuel, and emergency repairs whenever layoffs struck individual households. Nobody kept score. Nobody expected repayment. Every contribution was described as an investment in neighbors rather than charity. Caleb smiled quietly. They built their own safety net. Emma nodded without looking up, long before anyone else would. Several pages later, she discovered folded letters tucked between the entries. Unlike those hidden beneath pine tree number 27, these included detailed lists of anonymous assistance delivered throughout the camp. One worker repaired a widow's roof. Another quietly paid medical expenses after a logging accident. Others purchased textbooks so children could remain in school despite shrinking family incomes. Emma felt increasingly moved by the ordinary generosity filling every page. There was still no mention of hidden riches, missing fortunes, or dramatic conspiracies. The journal preserved something much simpler and somehow far more meaningful. Near the final section, one entry caught her attention. It described selecting a trusted family to preserve the journals after Black Pine eventually closed. Their responsibility would be protecting the records until everyone directly involved had passed away. Emma slowed her reading. A list of several family names followed the explanation. She recognized none until reaching the final entry on the page. Carter. Her breath caught. Caleb noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" Emma silently turned the journal toward him. Her family name appeared clearly among the handwritten list. Next to it, someone had added a short note. To keep the record safe if all others fail. Emma stared at the words. She had never heard anyone in her family mention Black Pine, the journals, or any connection to the logging camp. Her parents had died when she was young, and most earlier relatives were names preserved only inside family documents she had rarely examined. Yet here, decades before she was born, someone carrying her surname had been entrusted with preserving the workers' shared history. "Maybe you're related," Caleb said gently. Emma nodded slowly. "I think so." She carefully turned to the final page. Like every previous entry, this one had been folded inward and sealed with a brittle wax stamp that had survived the passing decades remarkably well. No writing appeared on the outside except 4 carefully printed words. Open only when found. Emma looked at Caleb. Neither reached for the seal immediately. After everything they had uncovered, both understood that whatever waited beyond the final page had been deliberately protected for more than half a century. Emma rested her fingertips lightly against the unbroken wax, knowing the last unopened section of the worker's story was now only one careful movement away. Emma Carter looked at the brittle wax seal for several long seconds before carefully sliding a thin pocket knife beneath its edge. The seal cracked with a soft snap that seemed unnaturally loud inside the abandoned railway station. Caleb Turner stood beside her without speaking. Both understood they were opening words that had remained unread for more than half a century. Emma unfolded the final pages with the same care she had shown every document since discovering the first journal hidden inside the old oak desk. The handwriting was familiar now, steady and deliberate despite its age. The opening sentence immediately caught her attention. "If you are reading this, then enough years have passed that no promise made here can bring shame to the families who kept it. Emma continued reading aloud. The final entries explained that Black Pine's decline had been slower than outsiders realized. Orders had fallen, equipment had aged, and the surrounding forest could no longer support the pace of logging that had once sustained the camp. Every week, another family feared losing its income. The workers understood the camp would eventually close. But they also understood that panic could destroy their community long before the final day arrived. Rather than allowing fear to spread, a group of senior workers proposed creating the confidential fund described earlier in the journal. Every family that still had steady wages quietly contributed something, no matter how small. Those contributions were never described as charity. They were recorded only as neighbors carrying one another through difficult seasons. Emma turned another page. Detailed notes explained how groceries had been delivered anonymously to struggling households. Winter coal appeared on porches before dawn. School fees were quietly paid. Medical bills disappeared without explanation. Even families receiving help often never learned exactly who had provided it. The workers wanted gratitude directed toward the community rather than individuals. Caleb smiled faintly. Nobody wanted recognition. Emma nodded. They wanted everyone to keep their dignity. The next pages finally answered one of the questions that had followed Emma since finding the first journal. The missing records had not disappeared because someone hoped to erase history or hide wrongdoing. Instead, many financial lists, contribution records, and personal agreements had been intentionally separated from official company files to protect families from embarrassment. If business owners, creditors, or outsiders had discovered which households required assistance, those families might have carried unnecessary shame for generations. The workers decided privacy mattered more than public credit. Emma lowered the journal for a moment. All this time, people assumed something suspicious happened because the records were incomplete. Caleb looked around the quiet station, when really they were protecting each other. She continued reading. One passage described the final meeting inside the logging camp office. The workers agreed that history might someday misunderstand their choices, but they accepted that risk if it meant preserving the dignity of their neighbors. The journal emphasized that no money had been stolen, no secret fortune hidden, and no one had profited from the camp's closing. The greatest treasure left behind was the example of ordinary people refusing to abandon one another when work disappeared. Emma felt a quiet ache in her chest. Only weeks earlier, she had believed losing her own job to automation meant she had somehow become less valuable. Yet every page before her insisted that human worth had never been measured by employment alone. Another section explained why the second journal had been moved to the railway station. As Black Pine prepared to close, trains carried away the final equipment and records. The workers believed the station offered a safer location than the increasingly empty camp office. While the first journal remained hidden there to preserve the daily life everyone had shared, splitting the journals ensured that if one disappeared, at least part of their story would survive. Caleb carefully examined the hand-drawn lists preserved inside the final pages. Everything fits, he said quietly. The letters, the buried box, the missing pages, even what Owen told us. Emma nodded. For the first time since buying the abandoned office, the scattered clues no longer felt disconnected. They formed one consistent story built not on mystery for its own sake, but on trust carried faithfully across generations. Near the end of the journal, another folded sheet rested between the pages. Emma unfolded it slowly. It contained the names of families chosen to safeguard memories after the camp closed. Beside each name appeared a simple responsibility. Preserve photographs, protect maps, keep letters, maintain contact with former workers whenever possible. The final responsibility beside the Carter family remained unchanged from the earlier page. Keep the complete record until it can be shared honestly. Emma stared at the sentence. Her family had never been chosen because they were wealthy or influential. They had simply been trusted. She wondered whether her parents had ever known that responsibility existed, or whether the knowledge had quietly disappeared with time. Caleb rested one hand lightly on the old table. Looks like the journals finally found their way back. Emma smiled softly. Not because I was searching for them, because you cared enough to follow every clue. Late that afternoon, they returned to the abandoned logging camp office, carrying both journals together for the first time in decades. Emma placed them side by side on the oak desk beneath the photographs recovered from pine tree number 27. The office no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied by memories patiently waiting to be heard again. As they organized the letters and maps into protective folders, another truck pulled slowly into the clearing outside. Emma recognized Victor Hale climbing out before he reached the porch. The owner of the region's modern lumber company looked around the weathered building before greeting them politely. I've been hearing quite a few stories about this place lately, he said. Emma invited him inside. Victor glanced across the desk, covered with journals and photographs. You've certainly been busy. More than I expected, Emma admitted. Victor walked quietly through the room, studying the old pictures of smiling workers. After a long pause, he spoke. I came because I wanted to make an offer. Emma exchanged a brief glance with Caleb, but said nothing. This property isn't valuable as timber, Victor continued. The office itself will need expensive repairs. Still, I'd be willing to buy the land if you're interested. His tone remained calm, businesslike rather than aggressive. Emma thanked him but explained she wasn't ready to sell. Victor nodded respectfully. Fair enough. Before leaving, his eyes settled on the journals once more. Whatever you've uncovered, he said quietly, I hope it helps people remember the workers who built this county. Too many stories disappear when old buildings fall down. Emma watched him drive away before returning to the desk. She opened the second journal once more and looked at its final completed page. Beneath every explanation, every promise, and every carefully preserved memory appeared one final handwritten line she had somehow overlooked in the excitement of the earlier discoveries. She leaned closer and quietly read the closing sentence aloud. The last keeper of this record will carry the name Carter. Emma Carter sat alone inside the old logging camp office long after Caleb Turner had gone home. The two journals rested side by side on the oak desk, surrounded by carefully organized photographs, letters, maps, and handwritten notes. Outside, evening settled quietly over Black Pine Forest. Only a few weeks earlier, she had arrived carrying a cardboard box after losing her job to automation. Convinced that her future had narrowed to a single, desperate decision, now the abandoned office no longer represented failure. It had become the place where dozens of forgotten lives slowly returned to the present. The final sentence in the second journal remained open before her. The last keeper of this record will carry the name Carter. She read it again, still struggling to understand how her family had become connected to a story she had never heard. The next morning, Emma drove to the county records office before it opened. The small building contained shelves of property deeds, census reports, family records, and handwritten documents stretching back more than a century. A clerk directed her toward the genealogy archive after hearing the surname she was researching. Emma spent hours carefully following her family's history one generation at a time. Her parents had spoken very little about relatives before her grandparents, and many names were unfamiliar. Eventually, she located records belonging to her great-grandfather, Daniel Carter. His occupation surprised her. Rather than listing farmer or laborer, the faded census described him as a shipping clerk connected with the Black Pine Railway line. Emma immediately requested additional files. Among several routine employment records lay a brief newspaper clipping announcing Daniel Carter's retirement decades earlier. The article praised his honesty, describing him as a quiet man trusted by both railway workers and logging families alike. Nothing mentioned journals or hidden records. Yet Emma felt she was finally standing beside the edge of the story instead of looking at it from afar. Before leaving, she made copies of every relevant document. Her next stop was Hank Morrison's museum. Hank examined the genealogy records with growing interest. "This fits remarkably well," he said. "Your great-grandfather worked at exactly the place Owen described." Emma showed him the newspaper clipping. Hank smiled thoughtfully. "People often overlook small articles like this, but trust was everything in communities like Black Pine. If the workers needed someone to protect important records, a respected railway clerk would have been a natural choice." Emma nodded slowly. "Then maybe the journals really were passed through my family. Perhaps the responsibility faded with each generation until no one remembered why those papers mattered." The thought saddened Emma more than she expected. Her parents had died while she was still young. If they had known anything about Black Pine, she would never have the chance to ask. Yet instead of feeling frustrated, she found herself grateful that the journals had somehow survived long enough to find her anyway. That afternoon, Hank suggested contacting the remaining families whose names appeared throughout both journals. Together, they began making phone calls. Some conversations lasted only minutes because memories had faded over time. Those continued much longer as elderly sons and daughters recognized familiar names from the photographs Emma had recovered beneath pine tree number 27. Martha Doyle arrived first at the museum, carrying an old family album. She smiled warmly when Emma showed her copies of the completed journals. "My father always believed the truth would come home someday," she said softly. "I just never imagined I'd live to see it." During the following days, more families visited. Some brought faded pictures tucked inside drawers for decades. Others shared handwritten recipes, school certificates, holiday programs, or simple stories passed from grandparents who had once lived at Black Pine. None of the items solved new mysteries because the journals had already answered the important questions. Instead, every visit added warmth to the community that had existed behind the written pages. Emma carefully scanned photographs and labeled each contribution so nothing would be lost again. Caleb volunteered his evenings to help organize everything into protective archival folders. "This place is starting to feel less like an abandoned office," he said while sorting photographs. "More like a memory finally waking up." Emma smiled. "That's exactly how it feels." A week later, Owen Briggs felt well enough to visit the office himself. Caleb helped him climb the repaired front steps while Martha waited beside Emma inside. Owen paused just beyond the doorway, studying the restored room in silence. Though repairs remained unfinished, sunlight now reached clean wooden floors instead of thick layers of dust. The photographs lined one wall, while the journals rested safely inside protective display cases borrowed from Hank's museum. Owen slowly removed his hat. "I haven't stood in this room since the camp closed," he whispered. Tears filled Martha's eyes as she watched him walk toward the oak desk. He rested one hand gently across its worn surface. "We spent so many evenings here," he said, "arguing sometimes, laughing often, hoping always." Emma showed him the family records connecting Daniel Carter to the railway station. Owen adjusted his glasses before reading quietly. At last, he nodded. Daniel was exactly the kind of man we'd trust. He looked at Emma with quiet certainty. "Your family kept their promise, even if the reason was forgotten." Emma felt unexpected emotion rise in her chest. She had spent weeks searching for treasure, secrets, or explanations hidden beneath old floorboards and forest soil. Instead, she had inherited something less tangible, yet infinitely more meaningful: trust. Before leaving, Owen gathered everyone near the front porch for a photograph. Caleb set the camera on a tripod while Hank adjusted the timer. Martha stood beside Emma holding one of the recovered pictures taken decades earlier in front of the same office. Owen looked from the old photograph to the people gathered around him now and smiled. "Different faces," he said quietly. "Same story." The camera shutter clicked. Later that evening, Hank placed the newly printed photograph beside the older one inside a display frame. The two images, separated by generations, seemed to answer each other without words. As darkness settled outside, Emma looked around the office that had once seemed like nothing more than an abandoned building purchased for $95. It had become a place where forgotten voices could finally be heard again. She closed the second journal carefully before speaking to the small group gathered inside. "I think it's time," she said. Everyone looked toward her. Emma rested her hand gently on the worn leather cover. "The people of this town deserve to hear the complete story." The announcement spread through the county more quickly than Emma Carter expected. Hank Morrison placed notices at the museum, the library, the town hall, and several local businesses, inviting anyone connected to Black Pine Logging Camp to gather the following Saturday afternoon. The invitation was simple: a community presentation honoring the families of Black Pine and the newly recovered historical journals. Emma never described hidden secrets or extraordinary discoveries. She believed the journals deserved something quieter than sensational headlines. By the morning of the gathering, the restored logging camp office looked different from the weathered building she had purchased for $95 only weeks earlier. Caleb Turner had repaired the front steps and replaced the broken windows with donated glass. Volunteers from town had swept the grounds, trimmed overgrown weeds, and built simple wooden display tables inside the office. Martha Doyle carefully arranged family photographs beside copies of the recovered letters. Hank positioned maps, historical records, and newspaper clippings in chronological order so visitors could follow the story naturally. At the center of the room, resting beneath protective glass, lay the two journals, reunited for the first time in decades. Owen Briggs arrived early, moving slowly with the help of his cane. He paused outside the front door before stepping inside. His eyes wandered across the familiar room, now filled with sunlight instead of dust. "It feels alive again," he whispered. Emma smiled. "Because everyone came back." By early afternoon, families began arriving, one after another. Some recognized names written inside the journals before they noticed anything else. Others quietly stood in front of the photographs, searching for grandparents, parents, uncles, or neighbors they remembered from childhood. Conversations filled every corner of the old office. People introduced themselves through family connections rather than occupations. "My grandfather worked beside Samuel Doyle. My mother remembered Charlie's harmonica. My aunt lived in cabin 6. Stories that had survived only around kitchen tables finally met one another in the same room. Emma stood quietly near the entrance, watching strangers become neighbors through shared memories. When nearly everyone had gathered, Hank welcomed the crowd with a few simple words before inviting Emma to speak. She stepped beside the display case holding both journals. Looking across the room, she saw faces young and old, waiting patiently. Some families had traveled several hours simply to attend. Emma took a slow breath. "A few weeks ago," she began, "I lost my job when my company replaced much of its staff with automation. I believed I had reached the end of the life I had planned. With the last $95 I could spare, I bought this abandoned office because I needed somewhere to begin again." Gentle smiles appeared throughout the audience. "I thought I had purchased an empty building. Instead, I found people." She carefully lifted the first journal from its case. "These pages don't tell the story of wealth, hidden treasure, or forgotten fortunes. They tell the story of neighbors who refuse to let difficult times destroy their community. Emma explained how the workers created a confidential fund to help families facing hardship, how groceries appeared without names attached, how children stayed in school because anonymous neighbors quietly paid expenses, and how workers protected one another's dignity instead of seeking recognition. She described the missing records, the buried letters beneath pine tree number 27, the second journal preserved at the railway station, and the quiet decision to separate the documents so at least part of the truth would survive. Every explanation came directly from the journals themselves. No dramatic embellishment was necessary. The truth already carried enough weight. As Emma finished, the room remained silent for several long moments. Finally, Martha Doyle stepped forward, holding one of the recovered photographs. Tears filled her eyes. "My father never wanted anyone to thank him," she said softly. "He only wanted people to remember that kindness matters most when times become difficult." Several others nodded through their own tears. Owen Briggs slowly stood despite Emma's offer to help. The room immediately grew quiet again. "I spent years believing these stories would disappear with us," he said. "Not because anyone wanted to hide them forever, but because life moves on. People leave, buildings fall, memories fade." He looked around the office one last time before smiling at Emma. "I was wrong." Applause began quietly before spreading throughout the room. It wasn't loud or celebratory. It sounded more like gratitude. Later that afternoon, visitors signed a guest book beside the journals. Many added short notes beside their names. "Thank you for remembering. My grandmother would have loved this. Our children finally know where they came from." Emma read every message carefully. None mentioned money. None asked what the land was worth. Every note expressed appreciation that ordinary lives had finally been acknowledged. As the gathering slowly came to an end, Victor Hale returned to the office. He waited until most visitors had left before approaching Emma. "I owe you an apology," he said honestly. Emma looked surprised. "For what?" "When I first came here, I saw an old building with little commercial value." He glanced around the restored room. "I didn't realize I was looking at part of this county's history." Emma smiled gently. "Most people didn't." Victor nodded. "I'd still like to help, if you'll allow it." He explained that his company would donate lumber, roofing materials, and skilled labor to fully restore the office, preserving it as a permanent historical center rather than allowing it to deteriorate again. "No conditions," he added. "Just respect for the people who built this place before any of us arrived." Emma accepted with sincere gratitude. Over the following months, volunteers transformed the abandoned office into a small community museum dedicated to the history of Black Pine Logging Camp. The journals remained displayed together in a climate-controlled case. The recovered photographs lined the walls beside new family donations. School groups visited to learn not only about logging, but also about the quiet generosity that had held an entire community together during difficult years. Caleb continued helping with maintenance long after the renovations ended. Hank became the museum's historical advisor. Martha often welcomed visitors by sharing stories about her father and his friends. Owen attended the opening ceremony wearing the same gentle smile he had carried during the community gathering. Emma found herself spending most afternoons inside the office she had once entered as a frightened young woman carrying only a cardboard box and a sleeping bag. She organized archives, recorded family histories, and welcomed visitors curious about Black Pine. Sometimes people asked whether she regretted spending her last $95 on a collapsing building. She always smiled before answering. "It was the best investment I ever made." Not because the property became valuable, not because it changed her financial future, but because it gave her something she had been searching for without realizing it. Purpose. One quiet evening after the museum closed, Emma walked through the now peaceful office, stopping before the oak desk where the first journal had waited patiently for so many years. She gently removed both journals from their display case for routine inspection, turning their pages with the same care she had shown on the day she first discovered them. The signatures, photographs, letters, and handwritten promises no longer felt like forgotten history. They felt like trusted friends, when everything had been carefully returned to its place. Emma locked the display case and switched off the lights. Before closing the front door, she looked back one final time at the journals resting together beneath the soft glow of the security lamp. Then she smiled, knowing the stories of Black Pine had finally found their new keeper, and quietly whispered, "I promise they'll never be forgotten again."